we talked about the chicken who decided that crossing the road was a good idea because the other side of the road was better, at least as far as the chicken was concerned. And then, of course, you might question the chicken's moral knowledge and wonder philosophically why the other side of the road would be better than the side that you're already on. And that's a very profound and difficult question. But I believe that question is answerable. So I think that the reason the postmodern types who posit that there's a very large number of ways of looking at the world are correct, but when they stretch that and say there's no way of rank ordering ways of looking at the world in terms of their validity, then they've made a mistake. Now, it's not like it's a conundrum that's easy to solve. What's worth doing? Well, that's a very difficult question, but it's worthwhile attempting to answer it. So that's the next thing we're going to do, is we're going to attempt to answer it. So I'll get another army in motion here. So I want to tell you something first about consciousness that's quite interesting. And it's an argument against determinism. And I have to make this argument before I can make the next argument that I want to make. So we don't know that much about consciousness. Like, it's a real mystery. It's probably the ultimate mystery as far as I can tell. Because we don't understand how it is that we can be aware, or even what awareness means. And we don't understand the relationship between the existence of things and the fact that there is something that's aware of those things. Because it's not obvious what it would mean for things to exist if nothing was aware of them. So the problem of consciousness isn't merely the problem of awareness, it's even in some sense the problem of being, because being without awareness seems, well, it's incomprehensible in some sense. There's something, but no one registers it. Well, in what sense is there something then? In any case, consciousness is a mystery, but one of the things we do know about it is that you're more likely to be conscious when you do things that you don't know how to do. So, for example, if you take a native language speaker, Danish, that was the language that was used for this study, and you put someone in a scanning machine and you compute how much glucose their brain is using and how many areas are active. If you play Danish forward to them, like in its proper order, a very small part of their brain is active and they don't use much glucose. But if you play Danish backward, which is equivalent in phonic complexity, let's say, then huge parts of their brain light up. It's way harder to listen to Danish backwards than it is to listen to Danish forward. And it turns out that under most circumstances, when you're doing something that you don't know how to do, then your brain is very, very active. And then as you practice, what happens is that smaller and smaller part of your brain is activated until, and it kind of shifts like this. It's like your right and left hemispheres are activated when you're trying something new. And then the activity shifts over to the left as you practice, and the amount of your brain that's active gets smaller, and that continues to shrink until there's a small machine, let's say, that's formulated in the back part of the left side of your brain, and it's specialized for that particular activity. And then you've become expert at it. You've built the machinery that enables you to undertake that task in a rather deterministic manner, and now you don't have to be conscious. And so when you drive to work, you're thinking about what you're going to do at work. You're not paying much. You're watching the road and all that, but you're not thinking about the road the same way you were when you first gripped the steering wheel when you were 14 and you were learning to drive, right? And that was absolutely exhausting after 10 minutes because you've got all the circuitry built. You're looking 300 yards down the road. You know exactly when to push the brake. You know exactly how much you need to turn the wheel. That's all automatized, and you've turned into something approximating a deterministic organism. But that doesn't happen when you don't know what you're doing, and so that's what consciousness seems to be. That's what consciousness seems to be for, in some sense. It seems to be the mechanism that's operative when you don't know what you're doing. And it can't be deterministic. And I think the reason for that is that in order for you to operate as a deterministic organism, all of the biological substructures that enable you to undertake the activity have to be built. And you build them through practice. And then once they're built, they can run in an automated manner. And that is exactly how it works. I mean, you don't have to think much when you walk. That's automated. You don't have to think much when you ride a bike. You don't have to think much when you're playing the piano if you're playing a piece that you've practiced a tremendous amount. But if you stumble over a phrase, then you get conscious of where you stumbled, and then you go back and you practice and you practice and you practice and you practice, and you build yourself a new automatic circuit that will run automatically, and then you can continue with the music. And maybe your consciousness when you're playing the music is, it's bounced up above what you've practiced, and you can concentrate consciously on how you phrase the music and how you twist it and turn it, and on the higher order elements of the performance, consciousness is still operating, but a lot of it's running on automatic. And so consciousness is there when you can't run on automatic. Consciousness is what confronts the novel, or what confronts the unknown as such. And I think that's right. That's what consciousness does. And so you're a deterministic organism in some ways when you're running through your practiced and habitual routines. But when you're facing what you've never encountered before, then consciousness is operating, and it's the thing that faces the unknown and builds new structure. All right, so that's worth thinking about. And it's a good way of thinking about what a human being is like. And so, okay, so now let's play that out a little bit. So imagine we're trying to figure out how it is that you're interacting with the world, and what constitutes your mode of interacting with the world. And so you wake up in the morning, and what do you face consciously? Now you're conscious. You weren't because you were asleep, but now you're conscious. And what you seem to face in the world in the morning are the possibilities of the world. Right? You wake up and you think about all the things that you could do that day. And you could think, well, there's a very large number of pathways that lie there in front of you that you could conceivably walk down. And maybe you're worried about it because, well, there's too much on your plate, right? There's too many decisions to make, and that's kind of overwhelming. Or maybe you're excited about it because, there's a landscape of new potential that you can explore. Or maybe there's some balance there. But in any case, you wake up in the morning and you confront what's coming at you that you have not yet mastered. And that's the role of your conscience, of your consciousness, is to confront what's novel. All right. So you think about that for a minute. You see if you think. So that's the world that you confront as a conscious being. It's the world of possibility and potential. It's those things that you could do. And you might play with that in your imagination. Well, here's some things I need to do, and here's some things I could do, and here's what might happen if I don't do the things that I know I should today. For example, there's various cliffs that you might fall off if you don't manifest your responsibilities. And so you're toying with that field of potential that's in front of you. I think that's a good way of thinking about the reality that human beings occupy. We are in some sense deterministic creatures, but only once we've been transformed only once we've established our habits, and only then in an environment that's stable. But what we confront with the conscious part of our being is that territory which is as of yet unmapped. And consciousness is the attempt to map that territory and to plot our way through it and to establish the proper aims, and then maybe to become expert at it across time. But the consciousness is confronting the potential. That's what we do. We're the consciousness that confronts the potential. All right, now I'm going to put another army in operation here. I'm going to talk about the first part of Genesis. So there's this, and the reason for this is, well, I'm very interested in stories. I think they sit at the basis of our cognitive structure. In fact, I think the evidence for that is overwhelming, that we really look at the world through stories. And there's hierarchies of stories. Some stories are more fundamental than others. Some stories are deeper than others. And you know that because you know that there's great literature and there's cheap novels. And you know there's a difference between them. And the great literature is deep, whatever the hell that means. And the cheap novels are art. They're shallow. right? And we understand that metaphor, and deep means affecting many things simultaneously or something like that. And the deepest of narratives are the ones that are at the base of our culture, that everything in our culture depends on. And among those deep narratives is the narrative, say, that's outlined in Genesis. And Genesis posits a particular structure to the world. And the structure is this. So there's a potential. That's the tohu vabohu. That's the unformed chaos that exists, that coexists with God. That's one way of looking at it. And that word tohu vabohu, that comes from an older word, from a Mesopotamian word, Tiamat. And Tiamat was a particular kind of Mesopotamian goddess, and she was the goddess of chaos and the originator of part of the structure that gave rise to the phenomenal world. And so the tohu vabohu isn't nothingness exactly. It's not the right way to think about it. It's potential. And so there's this hypothesis in Genesis about the nature of reality, that reality manifests itself in part as potential, and part as the structure that confronts potential. And that's laid out in Genesis as God. It's laid out as God the Father, actually. And the idea there is that it's the same idea that I just laid out with regards to how you're operating in the morning. You wake up and the potential of the world is sitting there in front of you. And the question is, how do you encounter that potential? And the answer is, well, not with nothing. I mean, there you are. And you're a deeply structured thing. Now, you're not structured enough so that structure can just operate deterministically and transform the potential into actuality. You still have to make decisions, whatever that means. You have to make choices. You have to contend and wrestle with the potential before it manifests itself as reality. But it does do that. I mean, at least that's how we seem to treat ourselves, right? You get up in the morning, you know that there's decisions you have to make, and why does it matter whether you make those decisions? And the answer is, well, the way the world lays itself out actually depends on the decisions that you make. And you know, you're not omniscient enough to know with perfect certainty that if you make decision X, that event Y is going to occur. But you know, you're not completely blind and stumbling about either. And you often know perfectly well that if there's something important that needs to be done that you don't do, that some little bit of hellish chaos will definitely manifest itself, right? You're certain enough of that. And so you do react to yourself and treat yourself like you're a structure of what would you say? You're a dynamic structure of ability, something like that can contend with potential and transform it into reality. And that's exactly what's laid out sort of writ large in Genesis. You have God, who's the representation of the structure that interacts with potential. That's two things. And then there's a third factor, which is the process that mediates the interaction. So the way that story is told in Genesis is that what God uses to confront potential and to transform it into habitable order is the Word. And it's a separate thing. It's a process. Well, it's the same thing. It's akin, as far as I can tell, it's akin to your communicative consciousness. But it's on the large scale. It's something like that. And you use that to form the chaos into the world. Now, there's an ethical dimension to that too, which is quite cool. So, as the biblical corpus developed conceptually across time, the Word was associated with, the Word is logos, and it was associated with a variety of virtues, let's say. And I would say the primary virtue that it's associated with is truth. And so there's this notion in Genesis that God uses truth to encounter potential, and the consequence of that is the emergence of habitable order. And so what happens God does that, uses the word, creates things out of the potential, and then says repeatedly, and it was good. And so there's a moral hypothesis there too, which is absolutely crucial. And the moral hypothesis is that which is extracted out of potential with truth is good. And that's a hypothesis. And so then you might think, well, what do you do when you're lying there in the morning trying to figure out how you're going to wrestle with the potential that constitutes the day that confronts you? And part of the answer is, well, you make ethical decisions about how it is that you're going to interact with what's in front of you. You know, like maybe you didn't do something at work that you should have done, and so you're going to go give your boss a story about that isn't true about why it is that you didn't do it. And you think, well, that'll set things right. And of course, you don't believe that. You know perfectly well it won't set things right. But maybe it will stop you from being in trouble in that day. And maybe you feel guilty and ashamed about it if you have any bloody sense. And you know that the world that you're pulling into being as a consequence of your refusal to engage forthrightly with what's in front of you is damaging to you, and it's damaging to the people around you, and it undermines the integrity of the fabric of being itself. And you still might be inclined to do it because maybe you're deluded enough to think that you can get away with it. But I can tell you one thing, this is my opinion, but it's something that I've derived as a consequence of my thousands of hours of practice as a clinical psychologist. And one thing I've learned, which I'm not necessarily that happy to have learned, is that no one ever gets away with anything, ever. It always comes back to haunt you. And so if you take the easy way out while you're contemplating how you're going to interact with the potential that's in front of you, and you decide that you can warp part of the structure and you can hide something that's actually happened, you can hide it and you can deceive yourself about it and you can twist the structure of the world around so that somehow no longer exists. It's like, that's not a strategy that's going anywhere. That is not going to work. And all you have to do is think it through to know that, because first of all, you do know that when you do it, because you wouldn't feel guilty and ashamed and low about it if you didn't know that. And second, really? You think that you're capable of manipulating the structure of reality and transforming it into something that's false, and that's going to work? You think you can do that? It's like there's an arrogance in that that's, well, it's satanic fundamentally. Well, I mean that technically, by the way, but it's a non-starter. So anyways, in the book of Genesis, the notion is that, well, God uses the word, something roughly akin to consciousness, sort of, what would you say, something contemplated or conceptualized on the cosmic scale to interact with potential to produce habitable order, and repeats the observation that it's good. That's something seriously worth thinking about for the rest of your life. It's the fundamental element of a certain kind of faith. And the faith is this, that whatever it is that you bring into being as a consequence of participating in the truth is by definition good. And that's a hell of a thing to know. Now you can ask yourself, and maybe you should, if you believe that to be true, and maybe you don't. But if you do believe it to be true, if you believe that there's some possibility that it can be true, it puts a rock underneath you, you know? It puts a foundation underneath you. Because you can think, well, what do I have to do in order to interact with this potential properly? And the answer is, we just have to tell the truth.